Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Anne Napolitano took the literary world by storm with her tearjerker of a novel, Dear Edward, which was a best book of 2020 and is now a TV series. Her latest, chosen as the 100th Oprah Winfrey Book Club pick, is Hello, Beautiful. In Hello, Beautiful, a reserved William Waters meets and falls in love with Julia Padovano and becomes a part of her rambunctious family living in Chicago. In a nod to Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, Napolitano introduces us to the Padovano sisters who transform William's life. But when darkness from William's past surfaces, jeopardizing not only Julia's carefully orchestrated plans for their future, but the sisters' unshakable devotion to one another, the result is a catastrophic family rift that changes their lives for generations. Anne Napolitano's new novel is Hello, Beautiful. Her previous novel, Dear Edward, was an instant New York Times bestseller, a Read with Jenna selection, and is now an Apple TV Plus series starring Connie Britton. Hello, Beautiful is the new novel, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Anne Napolitano to this week's book show. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So thank you so much for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you on the program. This is a beautiful novel, and it is something I enjoyed immensely. Where did the idea, or at least the idea of having a Little Women type book come to you?
The Little Women aspect actually didn't come to me until I was about 100 pages into the book. I knew that I was writing about a sad little boy named William who was dribbling a basketball. And I knew there were four sisters and that he was going to become enmeshed in their family. But it was only when there was a scene in which the four sisters were talking to each other and they started comparing which March sister from Little Women they most resembled that I thought, oh my gosh, of course, like there are four girls and four girls. And in Little Women, there's Laurie, the boy on the outside who's lonely, who's peering in through their living room window, wishing he was in there. And the same situation, in a way, is taking place in this book where William is on the outside and very lonely and wants to be in the room with them. And it was only then that it occurred to me. And then I was like, oh, I see possibilities with that. But it was not something that I had figured out ahead of time.
So what was it that drew you to tell a very multi-layered family story?
I wanted to write about a group of sisters. When I was growing up, my best friend down the street, Leah, I slept at her house nearly as much as I slept at my own. And her mom has five sisters, and they would come in and out of the house at all hours as if it was their home. And they all had slightly different versions of the same face. And they were all about 5 foot tall, and most of them had curly hair. And it took like 3 years for me to figure out which one was which. But when they were all in the same room together, they seemed more powerful than they seemed when they were apart. And I used to watch them like it was a television show when I was at Leah's house. And I wanted to try and write that kind of interwoven root system that comes with that kind of family.
And yet, the start of the book, you start it with William, and William, who is very sad and very lonely. And what brought you to him?
I think two things. The first and probably dominant one was that when I started writing this book in April 2020, which was like sort of the beginning of the pandemic. I live in New York City, so we were like fully shut down at that point. In that month, my father also died. And because of the time of the pandemic, we weren't able to be with him when he was dying, and we weren't able to gather when he did die, which is something that so many families went through during that period of time. But it was this sort of unprecedented, isolated experience on top of this other very scary, isolated experience of the beginning of an unknown pandemic. And I write in many ways to make sense of the world. So I started writing this book and I felt lonely and fractured. And so entering the book with William felt right. And when he was drawn to sort of the vitality and connection of the four Padovano sisters, I was drawn to them too. I also wanted to be in that room. I wanted to gather with the people that I loved and sort of tussle with them in the ways that we do when we're all in each other's daily lives and connected. And then the second thing that brought me in with William was that I feel like I have an obsession, like small or large, that leads me into every book. And in this book, I had developed an obsession with the history of basketball. And over the last few years before writing this book,
Mm.
I had read countless books about the history of basketball. And so I knew that he was a basketball player. And I saw this lonely little boy dribbling a basketball. And that also led me to William.
It's a connection too that he'll have of the one thing that he can talk about is basketball. And even though he is injured to the point where he can't play, it's still a major part of his life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the team structure, his best friend that he develops in college, who remains his best friend for the rest of his life, is a teammate. And I think that there's this beautiful structure that teams provide to our loneliest and the misfits and the people who really don't know how to find a place. A team allows people in, and it sort of allows for differences within the whole, and yet there's a commitment to each other that's just baked because you are on that team, and that's incredibly important for William.
And Napolitano is our guest on this week's book show. The new novel is Hello, Beautiful. In talking about William, it's so crushing because he's basically been written off by his family. They had a tragedy and a very when William was very young, and really he has nothing to do with his parents, and they have no real interest in him, and that's such a sad element to the story.
In my prior book, Dear Edward, in the premise of that book, the Edward is the sole survivor of a plane crash in which his parents and his brother and everyone else on board dies, and he survives. And in that book, I needed to know whether a person in that child in that situation could find a way to be okay. And actually, I felt similarly with this book, where instead of climbing out of a physical crash, William is really climbing out of an emotional disaster of growing up in a childhood where he was neglected and unloved. And I needed to find out whether there was a way for the world to step forward and help a boy like that become okay. And the Padavano sisters are a big part of that. But I really didn't know what the answer was. And that's part of what drove me through the writing of the book, was trying to
Mm.
find the true answers at each step and be like, does this feel true? And which way are we headed?
Because at one point I thought, oh, William is going to fall into this family and they're going to embrace him and he's going to find the love in the Padavano sisters' parents that he didn't get from his own parents. And well, the Padavano parents are pretty messed up too, right? So this this is interesting in that, especially Rose, the mother, that it's an odd family dynamic that brings these sisters, which I assume is why they are as close as they are.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, and I also think the Panvano sisters' parents are messed up, but really they're messed up in the way that we're all messed up.
Oh,
There's
absolutely.
there's kind of,
Sure.
you know what I mean? So there's William's parents, it's a little more extreme because it's unusual to have that kind of coldness towards your own child. But I think that when William arrives in their life, Rose and Charlie, the parents of the Padavano girls, do have a strong impact on him. It just isn't fully healing. He grew up without sort of an infrastructure of love inside himself, and that's a really complicated thing to build as a person. And I'm sure Charlie and Rose had a positive role in that. It just takes much more than that.
And not to argue plot points with the author, but but Rose is
Feel free.
but Rose is pretty cold to some of her own daughters. I mean, really to the point of extreme.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting in life, and then interesting to write about, is that the sort of fault lines of our parents appear in our own lives too. William actually ends up recreating some of the mistakes of his parents as he gets older and has more people in his life. And Rose, when she was younger, got pregnant out of wedlock, and her mother turned away from her. And Rose devotes her life to having her four girls not fail in the way that she did. And in being so sort of ironclad about that desire, she fails. And one of the girls recreates the situation that Rose was in, and she also turns her away, which is what her mother did to her. And I think that happens more often than not. The thing that's locked us up as children and the things that happen to us, it's very hard for us not to perpetuate them when we have our own children. It's like a pattern that exists inside us, and we have to sort of consciously break it. And Rose is not self-aware enough to do that.
You have a beautiful line in the book that I tagged, which is, Julia wondered if all four girls' voices lived inside their mother. Emmeline's earnestness, Julia's clear directives, Cecilia's excitement about the palette of colors that made up the world, Sylvie's romantic yearning. Perhaps Rose simply masked her daughter's voices with her own gruff tone, her own twist of anger and disappointment, but they were all there, buried within her, which is ultimately what they're all trying to find at some point, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true that those girls are, she loves her girls so much. And there is some people can love with their hands open and allow change and allow growth, and even for the person you love to step away and then come back. And some people really are scared and they want to control their life. They want to try and control the outcomes, and therefore they try and control the people that they love. And Rose and Julia really fall into that camp. And that doesn't mean that they love any less than anyone else. If anything, they love just as much or more. It's just that the sort of outcomes of that are strangled as opposed to generous.
And things change when their father passes, and as you said, your father passed as you were writing this. You write, Sylvie and her sisters had known themselves under their father's gaze, and with that gaze gone, the threads that had tied their family so tightly together had loosened. Well, even though you're all together, you do feel a bit orphaned, don't you?
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, having gone through it myself as well, is when you lose like a foundational person in your life, particularly if it's your family of origin. So you grew up as a child in this sort of hierarchical system. And when one piece is removed, everyone else's roles shift because there's a vacuum. That can go, well, badly, anywhere in between, but it's complicated and it's difficult for everyone, I think. And it wasn't something that I anticipated, but it makes complete sense to me when I think about it. But I also, in writing Charlie's passing, which I didn't know was going to happen ahead of time, it was really nice for me because I got to go through the wake and the burial and the gathering for his passing that I wasn't able to go through for my father. So there's ways in which writing this book was really nurturing for me. Even as his girls were grieving for him, I was able to grieve for my own father.
You mentioned at the beginning about your friend and their sisters, but you have siblings?
Yeah, I have a brother and a sister and a half sister.
So it's different, right? It's a different makeup.
It is. I mean, I think siblinghood is always really fascinating and always really complicated. But that particular mix of four,
Right.
siblings of the same gender being really woven together is singular.
Let me ask you a couple of questions about the way you have crafted and set up the novel. Characters get their own chapters, and you tell us about them. It also is bringing us chronologically through their lives in large swaths of time. So you knew from the beginning this was gonna be a long haul, a long story about a family and all of its various stages.
Yeah, I did. I knew when I start, I kind of know like between 3 and 5 things that are going to happen in the book. And so one of them, obviously, William marrying Julia, I knew I had to get there. And that itself was, spanning the first 20 something years of William's life. And then the next thing that I knew was a few years after that. So I kept sort of like trying to move through time in a concise enough way that I could reach the story sections that I knew existed. I really wasn't sure how far forward I was going to go, but I kept knowing that the story wasn't, in a 1 year period. This was something that was more expansive.
And Napolitano is our guest in this week's book show. Hello, Beautiful is the name of the novel, and it is published by the Dial Press. Talk about the relationship between the four sisters and how dependent, and really, again, this relationship evolves throughout the novel, but there are times where they are so linked and so understanding and really are at a point where if one is unable to do something, then they rely on the other one to do it. It is a fascinating quartet to see them operate.
Yeah, it was really fun to write them. So Julia is the oldest, and she is the like movie director. She's a master fixer. So if her sisters have a problem, they come to her, and she tries to fix it. She tries to organize everything so that everything goes as well as possible at all times. Sylvie is only 10 months younger than her, and she works in their local library. And she's a voracious reader, and she has this giant dream of finding like a once in a generation love affair. And then the two younger sisters are twins, Cecilia and Emmeline. They are extremely connected, the two of them. But the four sisters as a whole do operate when they're young as a unit. They each recognize that they have different skill sets. And so they go to Julia for things being fixed. They would go to Sylvie for a kind of like ethereal wisdom. Cecilia's the artist. Emmeline takes care of them all. But they operate as a whole in this really beautiful sort of symphony of their skills. But then as they grow older, each of the sisters actually makes a bold choice for herself in order to be true to herself and how her life moves forward. And there are consequences to each choice that each sister makes. Those choices require them to step apart from each other in different ways. And there are ways in which they are able to stay connected and ways in which they aren't.
And yet, whatever those complications are, there is a persistence. They continue and they don't give up. There's always going to try to be that connection because it seems like it's ingrained, even if it isn't, that it should be that they're connected.
Each of them, with possible exception of one of them for a period of time, fully realize that they're not completely themselves without being in concert with their sisters. And they realize how special and beautiful that is, and that they don't feel fully alive and they don't feel fully happy unless they are standing together one way or another and appreciating each other. And I think they have a special awareness of that. I think a lot of us are in relationships that are beautiful in various ways, but sometimes we don't appreciate it. The four sisters remain aware from the beginning of the story to the end that what they have is actually very special.
To talk about the dynamic, there is a complex that these sisters live in, which is interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, with the twins, when they are in adulthood, they live together really from the beginning of their life going on. But as they sort of have partners and etc., they buy two houses next door to each other, and they share the two houses. They take down the fence between the two houses, and they mix up their plates and cabinets. One of them has a daughter, Izzy, who moves back and forth between the two houses on a whim, according to which bedroom she wants to sleep in that night. It was really fun to write about that way of living. And I think it sounds pretty wonderful as long as obviously adore the people that are in those two houses.
The children are very much a part of driving what the adults do to often, it seems to me, to make more common sense choices.
Yes, I think that's the way it is. Like Rose, even for her daughter, she wants them to do better than she did. And the same thing happens for Julia and Cecilia when they each have a daughter. Then their focus goes not on their own lives in a way, but in, creating a life for their daughters where they'll thrive. And they just have different definitions of what that means. Julia is perhaps have a more controlling framework for that than Cecilia does.
When you were writing this, did this come easier than Dear Edward?
Well, yes and no. Dear Edward took me 7 years to write, so it took a long time.
Mm.
But I really loved writing it. I felt like I walked into that world every day, and it was sort of light and airy, and I was really happy to be inside of it. And this book, I think in part because of when I started it and the pandemic and my father passing away, it sort of like grabbed me by the lapels and just pulled me in. And I wrote it in 2 years, which is by far the fastest I've ever written a book. It felt like this book actually existed. The story was inside of me and I was feverish with it. And the only way for me to sort of break that fever was to get it all right and to do justice to these characters and make sure that I was telling the like true whole story for each of them. I felt driven with it, which sounds really unpleasant, but it was a very engaged state to be in.
I love that idea of being driven, but do you know what it was about the novel, what it was about the story, what it was about the characters that controlled that and had such an impact and drive for you?
I think it's my most personal novel. The things that happen in this book are not things, or they're not events that have happened to me. But I really felt like I was trying to figure out what love was for myself. I was trying to explore the idea of being seen for who you really are, as opposed to when people in your life look at you and see someone that you don't recognize. All of these things felt very, very real and very current for me during the period I was writing it. And I needed to express it as perfectly as I could and figure out what I actually thought and what was actually important within this sort of loving each other framework, all different kinds of love, the sister love, the mother daughter love, the romantic love. Somehow I think because of my father's death, like all the emotions in it were my emotions. And so I felt tied into this book with like every fiber of my being in a way that I hadn't experienced before.
So, not to psychoanalyze you here, but I do want to read a line from the book. This comes later. One of the characters works in a library. She glanced at the top shelf of one cart. It was filled with new releases. The bright, shiny covers of new books always made Sylvie a little sad. The authors and publishers were hoping their book would take the world by storm, and that was almost never the case. Sylvie had been working in this library since she was 13, and she'd seen hundreds of thousands of books move on and off the shelves. She thought that witnessing this endless merry-go-round of books was what had ultimately put her off trying to publish her own. So, dear author, what do we read into that?
Well, I I think it's true. It makes me a little sad too. I wrote two novels during my 20s that never were published. One, I couldn't get an agent and it wasn't published. The second one, I got an agent, but she couldn't find an editor for it. So it went in. So I had two novels go into a drawer. And then I wrote two novels during my 30s that were well reviewed, but came out very quietly and very few people read them. So when I wrote Dear Edward, part of why it took 7 years was because I wrote it really kind of at my leisure, because I was like, well, it's not going to get released. It's not going to get published. I'm like a mid-list writer at this point which just means sort of like a middle-aged writer who hasn't had very much success, which is not very exciting for publishers. So I was like, I'm really writing this like for me, and because this is what I love to do. And I only feel whole if I'm writing and trying to create a world. So I was really doing it for myself. And so the success that has come with Dear Edward and Hello Beautiful has been surprising, very surprising to me. Like I didn't expect it. There was no way in which I thought this was on the table. But it also reinforced for me that I do this for the love of it, and that it's kind of like winning the lottery or something. I feel like I've won the lottery with the last two books, and I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate the chance to keep doing the work. But I'm aware that this is singular and not the norm and not to be expected.
The first novel was a Read with Jenna selection, and then this novel is very special because it is the 100th book club pick by Oprah. Talk about winning the lottery. You get a call from Oprah, and your book has been chosen. There was a whole article about this in the New York Times, which is fascinating if people want to read it, but of what that's like for you and what it's like for the book industry, because it's a whole thing, right? It makes
Yeah.
it makes the release of your book not just the release of your book, but a major world event.
Yeah, it's hard for me to that doesn't permeate me. Like you can say that, and I'm like, I guess you're right, but that has not sunk in, and I think that's okay. It's good that it doesn't sink in. Just having her call me on the phone out of the blue and tell me that she loved my book, I was like, we could just stop right. Like I didn't actually need her to say that she was making it a book club pick. Like it was like having my television call me from when I was 14, and I used to watch her show at 4 p.m. every day. Like that was such an amazing thrill. Like, I'm so grateful to have gotten that phone call and to have gotten to meet her and to have her had read my book, much less loved it.
Right.
But beyond that, obviously in the publishing world, book clubs are this massive cog in this massive machine that is the dream to achieve one of them. And it gives your book a platform that is almost impossible to get other ways. So I'm incredibly grateful. And my, publisher is very, very happy. I'm very happy that Oprah read my book and liked it.
When you think about the impact that it has on future writing, not just Oprah, but just the fact of the success of where that brings you now, of getting all of those cobwebs out and say, okay, we're going to do this again.
The biggest change in my life when I sold Dear Edward was that for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel guilty when I wrote. And that was enormous. I always felt guilty when I sat down to write. I have 2 kids. I felt like I should have more of a real job. And I always was cobbling together. Like I did do some teaching. I had done some corporate writing,
Right.
But I was like, I should get a real job and or be with my kids. So I always felt guilty. And for really achieving that kind of success made me drop that guilt and be like, oh, this is my job and it's okay. Like, which is so exciting. And I think that's part of the reason that I wrote Hello Beautiful so much faster, was because I wasn't fighting within myself the whole time about whether I was allowed to do this. Really, that's the beautiful thing. I can now start writing another book and it's like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And I don't have to apologize for it or, come up with some sort of complicated system in which I'm allowed to do it.
It's wonderful to see a book this beautiful and amazing get all of the praise that it has gotten and that it so deserves. The name of the new book is Hello Beautiful. Ann Napolitano is the author. It is published by the Dial Press. Ann, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really do appreciate it.
Again, Ann Napolitano's new novel is Hello Beautiful. It is published by the Dial Press. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening. For The Book Show, I'm Joe Donahue.